Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another Designlab webinar. I am Emily. I'm the community manager for Designlab, and we're going to give everyone about a minute or two to join. Yes, say hello in the chat if you haven't done so. Hedy or Hetty is the first one, so awesome. So yeah, say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Feel free to connect with each other, share your LinkedIn, all that fun stuff. If you have questions along the way, please pop them in the questions tab on the right-hand side, so that way we can make sure that we get to them, or get to as many questions as we possibly can before the hour is up. So yeah, oh, we have a lot of, wow, we have everyone from everywhere today. Oh, hi from San Diego. I'm here too. Lots of folks from San Francisco, New York, LA, Canada. Hello from North Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us. Yay. Oh, yay. Cool. As a matter, we have everyone from everywhere.
Nice.
This is awesome. All right, cool. So, yay, from Egypt. Holy moly. And from Germany. Wow. Thank you for spending the later part of your day with us. It's still quite early here in San Diego. It's only noon. My brain's not awake yet. All right, cool. So we're going to get started. So like I said, I am Emily. I'm the community manager for Designlab. And today I have Ximena with me. She's the author of Listen Like You Mean It. And she's going to be giving us an awesome presentation today on just, how to be a better listener. I think a lot of us, we can probably benefit from some of the tips that she's going to be sharing, but it definitely goes a lot deeper than just tips and tricks. So I'm going to hand it over to her so she can introduce herself and dive right into her presentation.
All right, I'm going to share my screen and get set up here.
And if you want to turn off the notification sounds, I think there's like a little bell in the bottom right corner. Yeah, so that way we don't hear the ping, ping, ping.
I see it.
Cool. All right, yes. Say hello in the chat. Like I said, put your questions in the questions tab, and Ximena's going to get us started.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, I'm super excited to be here with you all today. Thanks for tuning in from all around the world. Today we're going to talk about how to be a better listener, and we're going to borrow some of the skills from being a user researcher and taking that outside of the UX lab and learn how we can apply these skills in just about any conversation you have, whether that's at work or at home. So in a little bit more detail, what we'll go over today, I'll share a little bit about me, who I am, why I'm here, and why I think listening is so important. And specifically, I want to talk about empathetic listening. So that's a kind of listening that I think doesn't get paid attention to nearly as much as it should. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into the brass tacks of how you can bring empathetic listening into your day-to-day lives. And we'll have time for Q&A too. So a little bit about me. I'm a user researcher by training. So I've worked at companies like Twitter, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. And I've worked in management roles and individual contributor roles. Some of those companies I joined pre-IPO, some post-IPO. I've also worked at tiny startups that were 8 people. So have a bit of a range in terms of the kind of research that I've gotten to do and the kinds of environments I've gotten to do it in. So I'm happy to chat more about that. I'm also a writer, so that's something that I've been doing on the side outside of my 9-to-5 for many, many years. And I'm lucky to be able to write for companies like Fast Company and The Muse and Medium, among others. And I'm the author and illustrator of a new book that just came out called Listen Like You Mean It. And a lot of what we're talking about today will be pulled from that book. So if it starts to pique your interest, just know that there's a lot more material if that's something that you're interested in. And because I also think it's helpful to get to know someone beyond just their job titles, I'm also an ENTJ on Myers-Briggs, if you're familiar. I'm an Aquarius, so a little bit quirky. I'm a New Yorker, so a little sassy. I'm a first-generation American, and I have a toddler. So that's a little bit about me. I want to start by talking about user research, just very briefly to kind of ground ourselves in what that is, and you'll see why I think that's valuable as we start to pull those lessons into listening in our everyday worlds. So UX research, which is my field of training, is really the art and science of understanding humans, people, in order to build better products. So if you've ever had an idea for a product or for a design and wanted to get a sense of, hey, is this something that's only going to be useful for me, or is there a real market out there for this, or is this just a kind of passing fad? UX research can help answer those questions, and there's many methodologies. There's behavioral, looking at behavioral data from a quantitative perspective. You can look at market research data and look at, what is the broader market? How are they behaving, or what are their perceptions? And you can also rely heavily on conversation through qualitative research. And that's what I'm going to focus on. That's where my expertise comes in, and that's what I think is most applicable to listening. So we'll hone in on that specifically. What do researchers do? Well, they're kind of like detectives, coaches, therapists all at once in these conversations, but they fundamentally help answer questions about people in order to build better products. So that could be things like, is my product usable? So usability testing. Or is my product easy to understand? Can we test comprehension? Are people picking up what I'm putting down through my product? What are people's perceptions of my brand, right? If you're a company like Facebook, you might want to know what people think of your brand. And then ultimately questions like, well, how do people do X, Y, Z? Like, what is their routine? What is their need? What's their motivation? And typically this is always used to help assess whether you're heading in the right direction from a product and design perspective. And I mentioned a little bit about some of the methodologies that you can use, but just to kind of go a layer deeper, a lot of the core skills, especially for qualitative researchers, are using things like design thinking and product sense. So that's understanding what are the heuristics, what are the strongest models and patterns to use for a product. It's bringing curiosity, storytelling, so you can share what you've learned with your team. And it's also moderating conversations and, crucially, listening. So that's what we're going to focus on. So you might be wondering, well, why listening of all the skills that we could talk about? I think part of it is that I don't think it will be a surprise to folks to recognize that, today's world is really noisy. We're in this particular cultural moment or technological moment where mobile apps have become so core to how we move through the world, and that's really affected how we communicate, but also how we consume information. And there's a lot coming at us at all points, right? Whether that's social media, email, or otherwise. And we're also in this uniquely culturally and politically divided moment where we have really strong opinions, and we're kind of having trouble often kind of seeing eye to eye and having conversations about our differences. And as a result, we're having a hard time getting through to each other. I think we can probably all think of at least one conversation or person in our lives who we have this challenge with. And there tend to be two options when you get to that kind of impasse. One is that we kind of crank things up. So we say, well, the world is noisy and people have strong opinions and so do I. So I'm going to really lean into working on my pitch and improving my persuasion skills or my negotiation skills, basically working hard to convince other people to hear us out, right? That's one possible outcome of being in this environment. The other is that we cope not by speaking up, but by withdrawing. And so in this case, we might say, hey, I actually don't even want to have those conversations. That's too much for me. I'm just going to focus on myself and kind of turn inward and just manage what I can. The problem with both of these scenarios is that we're in the process failing to actually connect with each other, which is ultimately what we want, right? We're humans. We're not particularly interested in speaking into a void. We're generally interested in speaking to other people in order to connect with them in some way. It's built into who we are, right? We're social animals in a way that other animals don't need this. We do. And so there's a real risk that's happening, particularly in this moment with everything that's converging technologically, culturally, politically, that we're just not connecting with each other in ways that we may be used to or really want to and need to. So this is where I think empathetic listening can really be a useful way of moving forward. So I want you to stop for a minute and just think about a conversation that you've had maybe recently, maybe a long time ago, that left you feeling inspired or motivated or refreshed or recharged or just really understood and seen in some way. And think about who that was with and what it was about, but really tune into that feeling more than anything. It's kind of a rare feeling increasingly, but the thing is, that person, whoever you were talking to, was probably a really good listener. That's probably part of how they made you feel so seen and so understood. And that's what I want to focus on. I want to focus on how we can offer that to other people, and also how to receive it ourselves, because I think that's where that connection comes in. And that's what empathetic listening is all about. It's about that connection between two individuals or a group of friends or family or what have you. But it's really listening with the intent to understand others. That's where the connection comes from, understanding. And this is different than listening with the intent to convince or argue or debate or prove a point, right? That's a completely different kind of listening. It's also different from listening with the intent to advise or help someone solve a problem. Also a very different kind of listening. This is really about simply understanding the other person, and particularly their needs and their motivations and their emotional experience. And that's what helps you connect more deeply. And I think if you're familiar with research, then that list of needs, motivations, perceptions probably sounds familiar to you, and that's often what we're looking for as user researchers. So the idea here is that we're bringing that into our everyday conversations to understand other people in order to get to that deeper place of connection. And when we're able to do that, or when someone offers that to us, like, this is how we feel. We feel seen, we feel understood, we feel valued and cared for. And if you had trouble thinking of a conversation that made you feel that way, that's okay. I think that's a sign of how rare it is these days, or if you can only think of one conversation. But this is really what we're trying to bring more of into our day-to-day. When we're able to bring this in, the real gift of empathetic listening is that when we can understand others' needs, it opens up all of these doors for how we relate to people. So if I understand my teammates' needs better or my clients' needs better, then I'm going to be able to collaborate with them better. I'm going to be able to get more aligned with them, and quicker too than I would if I weren't really tuning into that. It's also going to help me respond better, more appropriately in conversation, if I can really understand what someone needs. And ultimately, it's going to build stronger relationships. And so this image that I have here is just kind of demonstrating this loop that opens up when you create space for someone and you listen to them and you bring this empathy into conversation, and they feel that from you, and they sense that, and they trust, and they can open up and offer the vulnerable sides of themselves. You're understanding a different side of them. And that sort of feeds into their ability to be vulnerable, because the more that we demonstrate that we understand someone, the more they're able to open up. And so it's this really nice virtuous circle that helps us understand people and connect with them and build stronger relationships. Most of us don't necessarily practice this kind of listening every day. What we're usually doing is something that I call surface listening. So surface listening is when we're capturing what is literally said. So we hear enough to stay polite with our neighbors. You know, we do the nod and smile. We're sort of confirming, yep, I'm listening, but we're not necessarily catching the meaning, the subtext of what's being said. And we're certainly not catching the emotion, the feelings behind what's being said. So we want to gradually go from surface listening down much deeper to empathetic listening. That being said, let's just acknowledge that there are some challenges. You know, there's a reason that most of us are not always in this empathetic listening mode. And that's things like there are environmental distractions. So you've got pets or children who are kind of distracting you in conversation, or I think we are all guilty of having a device that's distracting us from a conversation, those notifications, or just even putting it face down, your phone face down, having a one-on-one, but having your phone on the table. That's actually been shown to reduce our ability to be empathetic. So just the mere presence of the phone. So there's things in our environment that can distract us and make it hard to be empathetic listeners. There's also relationship challenges. So that could be a competitive relationship, could be, a coworker that you're competitive with. Well, it's going to be hard to really hear them out and understand them if you also at the same time are kind of trying to suss them out and figure out, okay, what angle are we competing on right now? There's also regressive relationships, which can make it hard to listen with empathy. So think of your family dynamics and all of the habits, tendencies that we feel like we outgrow as we become adults. And then you go right back home, you visit home for a weekend and suddenly you are the sullen teenager again, or, you're yelling and you haven't yelled for years, right? Regressive relationships can make it harder to listen with empathy. And the other relationship that I'll mention there are hierarchical relationships. So anytime there's a power dynamic in place, that can also make it hard for us to feel safe, to open up, and to really listen to what's happening in the moment, as opposed to, whatever anxieties we have about that particular relationship. And then lastly, there are topical challenges. So there are certain topics that we just really don't like talking about. They make us uncomfortable. And so when they come up in conversation, it becomes really hard to listen in that moment, because we're often kind of working on, oh gosh, I don't really want to talk about this, or this makes me uncomfortable internally. And that could be anything from taboo topics like religion to money, like discussing your salary with a coworker might be pretty uncomfortable. But it can also be what I call hot spots. So those are these sensitive spots, these sensitive topics that kind of rub you the wrong way, and they activate a really strong emotional response. And they're super personal, so they're hard to predict. So for someone, for instance, Mother's Day could be a wonderful day to celebrate a parent. For someone else, that's a really hard day for them because they don't have a great relationship with the parent, or whatever it may be. But so there are these personal hotspots that can come up in conversation and also make it hard for us to listen with empathy. The good thing is we can manage all of these, but just to say that, if you've kind of wondered, oh yeah, why am I always in this surface listening mode? It's probably some combination of these hurdles. So with that, I want to get into the nitty-gritty, the brass tacks of, okay, given these types of listening and where we tend to spend most of our time, how do we actually practice empathetic listening? How do we bring that into conversation? So the first thing that you have to do is bring in a certain intention and really bring in what I call a listening mindset. And that has three components. One is about bringing in humility, then curiosity, and empathy. And we'll talk about the three of those. So if you've ever conducted a research session or sat in on one of the things that you've probably heard the researcher say at the start of the session to the participant is, today I'm here to learn from you. You can't hurt my feelings. There are no right or wrong answers, right? Some version of that spiel. And the reason that we do that is to make sure that the participant, who is a stranger, who might not even know what company we represent, we want to make sure that they feel comfortable being open and honest with us. And often there's a perception that they might hurt our feelings. So if they don't like a design, they might not want to tell us that, because what if we worked on it and they offend us in some way? And so by opening with this idea of, hey, you're the expert today, I'm here to learn from you, that really changes the nature of our conversations. And we can take the same approach in our everyday conversations and really bring in this mindset, this intention that we're ready to learn, and that the person that we're talking to is the expert in whatever it is that they're saying. right, in what they're sharing. And it really means also setting aside assumptions or preconceived notions or judgments that we might have and that we might be bringing in into the conversation. So that's the first step. It's really just, it's kind of like you're clearing the cobwebs that you normally bring into conversation, just saying, hey, I'm open and I'm ready to learn. The second piece of a listening mindset is having curiosity. And this is really what allows us to go deeper in conversation. And it's interesting because I think sometimes we think that the best way to, be likable or meet new people or build a strong relationship is to be interesting, right? That draws people in. But actually what the research shows is that being interested is the most important thing. So demonstrating curiosity about other people and about their lives is much more important when you're developing relationships than it is to, tell a good story and try and be interesting. So you can demonstrate curiosity by asking what I call connecting questions. These are open-ended questions as opposed to close-ended questions, which are going to narrow things down. So a close-ended question would be something like, are you mad at me? That is going to yield a yes or no response. A more open-ended question would be, how are you feeling about our relationship, right? So how and what questions tend to be much more open-ended than is, are, and do questions. So that's one way of beginning to demonstrate curiosity. The other question or consideration that you can have here is particularly if this is a topic that you're not naturally interested in, because it's often much more difficult when someone is talking about, let's say, sports and you're not a sports fan. It's pretty easy for us to kind of shut down our brain. But instead of doing that, we can start to think about, okay, well, why is this person bringing up this topic? What does this tell me about them? What about their history or their experience makes this topic so relevant to them? What can I learn? Again, going back to that learning angle, what can I learn from them in this moment? It's also helpful if you're talking about something in which you are genuinely an expert to remind yourself, what else? What else could there be here? Because there's always something more that we can learn. And I think sometimes when we're experts in a topic, we can inadvertently, again, shut down pretty quickly because we feel like, well, I know this already. But retraining ourselves to kind of mentally think, okay, what else could be happening here? What else can I learn here? So those are some of the tips for demonstrating that curiosity and really cultivating it in conversation. And then finally, there's empathy. And empathy is really about understanding and tapping into another person's emotional experience. It doesn't mean you have to have that exact experience. So it doesn't mean that if someone says, I'm getting divorced and I'm having a really tough time with that you can't relate because you've never been divorced. It's more about understanding, wow, okay, what must that feel like? What might that feel like? What is this person telling me that feels like? Oh, okay, so there's fear, there's loneliness. All right, maybe you haven't had a divorce, but those things, everybody feels fear. Everybody has at some point felt loneliness. So it's tapping into the emotion beneath the experience. And that is going to help you understand the other person and thereby ask better questions, more informed questions. And then that's, again, a nice loop that happens where you continue to get deeper with another person. All of these things, when we combine them, so when we take humility, curiosity, and empathy, really what we're doing there is we're shifting the focal point from being focused on us, our experience, our assumptions, our judgments, what is interesting to us, and we're shifting it to what is interesting to the other person, or why is this relevant to the other person. So we're really kind of moving the dial in a meaningful way. The second part of practicing empathetic listening that I want to talk about, once you've started cultivating this mindset, you've set this intention, you're bringing it into conversation, is to recognize and seek to uncover what I call hidden needs. So in research, if you're running a research session, one of the common goals is to understand what are participants' needs in the context of the product or set of products that I'm looking into. And often those are latent needs. They're not necessarily made explicit. So, maybe somebody is talking about how they're a busy parent and they've got a ton of things on their plate and they're constantly context switching, and you're working on an app that has to fit into their worlds. Well, then you need to know that time is a scarce resource. In fact, they need more time and they can't have it, right? So you're looking for those hidden needs in order to inform a product. The same idea that there are hidden needs that are unspoken, often, sometimes they're explicit, but often they're unspoken, applies to our everyday conversations. And when we tune into that, it makes a really big difference. So here's what I mean. When we understand that every conversation has a hidden need, it allows us to tune into that person much more deeply. And so what are some of those needs, or what do they sound like in conversation? Well, the truth is that a lot of times we might hold back on sharing our needs. So it's pretty rare for someone to come into conversation and say, what I really need from you right now is to feel supported. Or what I'm really hoping from you in this conversation is to offer me advice or to help me feel validated. Sometimes people say that, but a lot of times it's far less explicit than that. And sometimes that's because we're actively holding back our needs. We are afraid to share them. We don't feel comfortable sharing them. There's many reasons why we might hold a need back. Another thing that can happen is that sometimes we think we're sharing needs. We think we're being super explicit about what we need, but we're not. So someone might say, oh my gosh, I have so much stuff on my plate. I've got all this work. I've got all this personal stuff. And maybe they're sharing that with, a roommate or a manager or something like that. And the need beneath that laundry list of here's all this stuff on my plate might be a plea for help. It might be to say, oh my gosh, please help me. I have too much on my plate. But if the person doesn't say, I need your help with XYZ, it's going to be hard to, get to that point. So sometimes we think we're sharing that need, but we aren't. Sometimes we're also not even aware that we have a need or that we're working on a need in conversation. But a lot of the times conversation is a space for people to process and to get to that need through conversation with someone else. So many reasons for why I call these hidden needs, not just needs, right? Because sometimes we're not explicit. Sometimes we don't even know that the need is there, but it is there. And our job is to, as a researcher would kind of investigate, our job is to understand what that hidden need is. So some examples of hidden needs, it might be to feel supported. Someone might come to you because they need to pick me up. Or it might be to vent. Someone might need space to get something off their chest. It could be just to provide an update, just to provide visibility on hey, this is what I'm working on. And I want you to see that. I want you to recognize that. Or it could be to problem solve. It could be to generate ideas and to figure out how to move forward with a problem. There's many needs that someone could bring into conversation. These are just some examples. And the goal really here is first recognizing that conversations have needs. But the reason we want to recognize that is because when we can tune into those needs, we can respond in a way that will help ideally meet those needs or bring us closer together, as opposed to completely misunderstand each other or even inadvertently push each other away, which happens sometimes when our wires are crossed. One of the things that makes it, that is sort of the other part of this equation, right, of understanding needs, the other part of the equation is your response in conversation. One of the things that's really important is understanding what I call your default listening mode. So this is the way that you tend to show up in conversation. This is how you naturally hear things in conversation. And it's a sort of filter, and each of us has one. And it's informed by our personalities and our early relationships. And the thing is, that filter can sometimes be really useful in conversation. But when we're not careful, when we're not tuning into the other person's needs, we can get it wrong, and we can use a mode that really just isn't going to help us connect in conversation. That's basically what this illustration represents. It's just this idea that it's good to be aware of those modes so that you can adapt them. And I'll go into examples of the modes now. So in the book, I talk about 11 modes. I'm only going to cover 4 of them today. And the thing to know about these modes is that they all are good. So there's no bad mode, right? And they all have their powers and their pitfalls. So for each of these, you're going to hear how it can apply in a positive way, and also how when it's misapplied, that can have some unintended negative consequences. So we'll start with the explainer. The explainer is really listening and scanning for what's the rationale behind what's being said. What is the reasonable explanation behind this? And that can be really helpful because it can help us see the bigger picture. So an example, for instance, would be if someone says, I'm so tired, I've been working so hard, I'm exhausted. An explainer might hear that and think, well, that's probably because of our culture of overworking. Burnout is very common. It's at an all-time high now, right? And they might share some stats or like look at the bigger picture and say, okay, this is how culturally we work, blah, 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 blah. That can be very helpful, very useful in the sense that it can be helpful to see how we as individuals fit into these larger issues, right? However, it can also be entirely unhelpful because the person might also say, well, yeah, I know, that doesn't change the fact that I'm really tired, right? So sometimes the explaining listening mode isn't effective and we have to really listen for what the need is. The other mode I want to talk about is the validator. So if you think about the people in your lives who are sort of your biggest cheerleaders and biggest advocates, chances are they listen to some degree, at least in your conversations, with a validating listening mode. So the validating listening mode is really about kind of encouraging you and saying like, yes, you're right. And that can be really helpful and encouraging, but also sometimes it's not. So if someone is talking about a difficult situation at work, for instance, a team that they're struggling to connect with or collaborate with, maybe the validator hears that and thinks, don't worry about them. They'll come around. I know you're doing everything you need to do to work with them effectively. Like basically some version of, it's not you, it's them. Sometimes that can be helpful because we really do just need a boost of confidence of like, okay, no, I am working really hard. It's gonna be okay. But other times, maybe we know that actually we're part of the problem, right? And we need to adjust our behavior in some way. And maybe we need advice as to how to do that. So in that case, that validating listening mode isn't helpful. There's also the problem solver, and I think this one is very common, particularly among leaders. So the problem solving listening mode is when you listen and everything you hear is listened to through the lens of a problem to be solved. So that can be really wonderful for generating ideas and, removing roadblocks and helping make forward progress. But it can be really unhelpful if the person is not actually looking for advice or solutions. So if a direct report is telling their manager about everything they're working on and the manager hears that as like, oh, that's too much, let's see what we can take off their plate. But the individual was just trying to say, hey, I'm working on a lot and I want you to see and recognize that, and appreciate that. The response of let's see what we can take off of your plate it feels like micromanagement. It feels like they're really missing the point. The last mode that I'll mention is the identifier. So identifiers are typically listening for how do I relate to what's being said, right? And so identifying can sound like, oh, that happened to me too, or that's exactly like when ... right? It's one person is telling a story and then the other person says some version of, oh yeah, me too. That can be really helpful in the sense that it can tell the other person, hey, you're not alone. Like, oh, you had a hard time with such and such a scenario, me too. So that can be comforting and affirming. However, if it's not what's called for, if that person isn't looking for affirmation, then it can just sound like they are, like you're dismissing them and you're effectively changing the subject. So it's no longer about the other person's experience. Now we're talking about your experience. And maybe the other person wasn't ready to make that shift. So that's the identifying, those are kind of the pros and cons of the identifying mode. No matter which of the modes you have or fall into, the real key here is to recognize that there is a mode that you carry with you into conversation and to ask, is that what's needed in the moment? And if not, what is needed in the moment? So going back to uncovering those hidden needs. So are you being asked to problem solve? Is this about validation? Are you just being asked for company? Which I think is something that we often forget, that there might not be anything that we need to do in conversation beside just listen and create the space for someone to share their story. Bearing witness to someone sharing their story can be very, very powerful and very connecting, and it's very rare. And so I encourage everyone to kind of keep that one in the back of their mind of like, oh, is anything actually needed here besides just my offering an empathetic ear to another person? If you're really not sure, if you've identified your mode, but you're still not quite sure about the need and what's necessary, that's totally okay. And that's where clarifying questions can be really handy. And so, if someone is sharing something, you can respond by asking them, hey, would it be useful if I shared how I've handled that in the past? Or, my instinct here is to offer some words of encouragement. Would that be welcome? Or would hearing some advice or potential solutions help? So you're giving people a chance to respond and say, oh, you know what, that would be really helpful. Or actually, that's not what I'm looking for, to help you hone in on what that need is and how you can help meet it. And the last one that I think is useful, particularly if you're really not sure where to start, is to just ask, would you like me to listen or respond? Because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes all we need to do is listen. And so that's a useful one to just keep in the back of your mind in case you need it. And as I mentioned earlier, really the goal here is now you're coming into conversation, you know that there are these hidden needs to listen for, and also that we have these modes that we carry with us, and we're just going to try and adapt to what's needed in the moment. The last thing I want to mention is that it's really important to practice self-awareness in your conversations. I think there's this idea that when we listen, we're there for someone else and we're kind of offering them our ear and that's it. But the truth is that the way we listen, how effective we are in our listening habits, comes down to what's happening for us in that moment, what's happening in our body, what's happening emotionally, what's happening in our mind, what thoughts are running through, what is our default listening mode. And so it's really important to be tracking that and to be aware of what you're bringing into a conversation, or maybe what wasn't there and now suddenly is in a conversation, because your experience in the moment can hinder your ability to stay present, stay empathetic, and listen. So I mentioned some of the things that could get in the way or that are important to be aware of, and that's things like your default mode. It's your hotspots, those really sensitive spots that we talked about earlier that are so unique to each of us, and only you can know that. No one can really know that for you. Only you can know, oh, I get really upset on my birthdays. I don't know why, right? Okay, that's a good thing to know. It's also knowing what your personal Achilles heel is and staying present. We all have them. I think we're all distracted by devices, but it's also things like knowing that you are much better in the morning than you are in the afternoon. Like you've got much more attention and focus for other people in the morning than the afternoon, for instance, or vice versa, right? And it's also understanding what your unique limits are for empathetic listening. So this is a practice that requires intention and effort and awareness, and we can't necessarily do it 24/7, and that's okay. It's more about being aware of what do you need in order to go into a conversation and be able to practice this, and when have you gone too far, or when are you approaching a limit. So for some people, that might mean they can have one really deep one-on-one conversation a day. For other people, they can have 4, right? And it's totally dependent on you and where your limits are. When I first started out as a researcher, for instance, I tried to schedule 6 sessions in a day, so 6 hours of listening in a day, just to bang out the study. And it was exhausting. And I realized very quickly that it was exhausting and that I could no longer actually hear the other person. And I would come home just completely drained. And so for me, that was a really clear, I had crossed a boundary and I needed to shift and adapt to my limits and say, okay, I'm going to split those 6 sessions over 2 days and I'm going to do 3 and 3. It's the same thing in your everyday conversation. So it's understanding, what do you need to feel energetic and present and empathetic in conversation. So that's just a little bit of what's in my book and some of the initial tips I wanted to share to help you become better listeners. There's a lot more in there, everything from asking better questions to help deepen a conversation to navigating difficult conversations, really fraught topics and things like that. So if you're interested, if this has piqued your interest in any way, just know that there's more material out there. And at this point, I'd love to open it up for Q&A.
Oh my gosh, this was amazing. And I believe a few people have already bought your book while you were talking. So
Thank you.
So fun. But we got some amazing questions in the questions tab. So I'm just going to fire it off with the first one that came up. What helps you generate empathetic questions? I guess it has been challenging doing it alone versus a team to bounce off of.
I think in terms of generating empathetic questions, I would say it's twofold. Part of that is going back to really understanding what is this other person experiencing in the moment and kind of building off of that. But the other is there are reliably effective questions that you can ask. And so going back to, starting with open-ended questions, you can have those be broad, but you can also have these gentle nudges along the way. So if you sense that someone is sharing a story or someone is gearing up to share something and is kind of tentative, you can provide these gentle nudges. And so that could sound like, in response to what they're saying, tell me more about that, or say more, or what else? One that I really like is actually just saying, because, someone starts a thought and you can kind of sense that it's unfinished. You can just say, oh, and that's because, and they'll naturally fill it in. So those are, I think, helpful, really, really small nudges that you can use in conversation.
Definitely. Cool. All right, next one. So this one may be a little bit more of a personal opinion type answer just based off of your experiences. But the next question is, from kind of looking at local authorities and public institutions, how can they practice listening empathetically to communities? Like I'm sure you've thought about it, but, kind of what's your take on that?
That's a big question, but I like it. So thank you. I think honestly, like the number one thing that I would focus on for, trying to facilitate those kinds of conversations at any level of government or other institutions would be going back to that listening mindset of really coming in with humility and curiosity and empathy. I think that's often missing in those conversations. I think it's rare to see those preconceived notions or agendas set aside and like really truly listening. I think often what happens is it's sort of like you do a listening tour, but you kind of already know what you want to do, kind of thing. So I would really, like, if I had to focus on one thing, that's where I would start.
That one's like a hot topic question for sure. We have a general question about your deck. Someone really, really loves your illustrations, so they were just wondering how you got that on your slide deck.
I do my illustrations on my iPad with pencil. I use a program called Paper by WeTransfer. It's pretty simple. I am not a super great Procreate person. I'm trying to be, but I would say, like, if you're just getting started in particular, it's very beginner friendly. And yeah, so that's where I do them, and that's very easy to get into a presentation.
Fun. All right, so shifting back, next question. What are the best ways for us to practice empathetic listening day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to what I mentioned earlier, I would say, pick somewhere to start, right? Like, the book has all of these areas that you could get started in. So you could start by working on your ability to stay present. That would be one thing. Or you could start with really tuning into what's happening for you physically in a conversation. So like, oh, noticing, oh, my chest is really tightening up, or my throat is sort of tightening up. That means I'm having a strong emotional reaction to that. So I would say pick, one of these techniques and work to master that first, and then kind of snowball from there.
I think you may have touched on this next one a little bit, but any, I guess, further tips on just practicing empathetic listening in a group setting?
I think one thing that is, two things I'll mention, which I think can be uniquely helpful for group settings. One, and I know this is hard when we're remote, but when, as things open up, I think bringing an observation to your empathetic listening practice is really useful. So noticing, particularly in groups, how are people physically relating to each other? So who's kind of like sitting back in their seat like this, and who's like really dominating the conversation. So using nonverbal gestures and understanding that to understand power dynamics and group dynamics can be really useful. The other thought that comes to mind for groups specifically is noticing whose voice gets heard in the conversation, whose voice is ignored. Noticing who is the decision maker in the conversation, who's the influencer, who might not actually be the decision maker. And it's useful to start to put these pieces together, because then you have much more understanding of like what's actually going on, what's at the surface being said, and what's actually going on. But also, if you're able to tune into this, I think it can be really useful to be an ally to the people who aren't getting pulled into the conversation, or to be able to say, hey, so-and-so made a great point. I'd like to return to that. I'm not sure we fully discussed it. Or I want to go back to what that person said. And so you can have much more inclusive conversations when you bring this into a group setting.
I love it. Next one, again, you may have already kind of touched on this in various ways, but how do you practice the different modes of listening?
Well, I think the different modes of listening, it's about recognizing which one do you sort of naturally come into, when do they change? So are there certain relationships where, you suddenly find yourself, oh, I'm always in this validating mode with this particular person. So a lot of it is observation. And then the other piece is, it's kind of like, if you've ever done a personality assessment, at work, where they say, oh, you're this kind of worker, and these are your skills, and these are your, areas to grow in. What you've probably rightly been told is it's not that you don't have this set of skills, it's that you really heavily rely on this set of skills. So we all have all of the modes within us. We all know how to be validating, or how to identify, or how to problem solve. It's about just tuning into those and dialing them up or down. So I do think I hope that's encouraging, that it's not, like you're learning these modes brand new. It's more like they're all within you, but we tend to use one more than the rest.
Definitely. I know I'm very guilty of always jumping into problem solving mode. And I actually catch myself now, especially when I notice that someone may be in distress, I'll actually ask them, would you want me to just be a listener, or, would you like me to come up with a solution for you? And normally that usually helps me kind of gauge, how I should be listening.
That's how it's done.
Self-awareness for sure. In general, do you have a YouTube channel, Ximena?
Oh, do I have a YouTube channel? I do not have a YouTube channel, although I'm flattered by the question. I'm on Instagram and Twitter. I'm fairly active there. And then I would say the other place that I'm pretty active is I have a newsletter. So if you're interested in that, that's ximena.substack.com.
If anyone likes the idea of having Ximena on an Instagram Live with Designlab, absolutely let us know. Maybe we can do that too. Yeah. All right. This one's actually a really good one, mostly because we have these sessions called group critique sessions as part of our UX Academy program. And this one comes up a lot from new students. How do you become a better listener when you have anxiety?
Is this about, is that anxiety about like how the conversation is going to go?
I'm assuming yes. I feel like sometimes, especially, I've been in that seat before where I'll go into a group setting and I'll just think about all the things that could potentially be said and what I could possibly say and not say.
Yeah, so I think this is where it can be really helpful to tune into your body. And I know I mentioned that briefly, but for instance, if your work is being critiqued, or if you're in a performance conversation, you probably know going into it that something could feel uncomfortable for you to hear, that, something you're really proud of maybe isn't landing well, or feedback that you've gotten before, you're getting again, and that can feel hard, right? So I think paying attention to when is that happening in your body, because sometimes we might start to shut down without realizing it, but if you can tune into what's happening physically, that's a good clue. I think also there's a really strong tendency to power through. So just say, wow, I'm uncomfortable in this conversation, but I don't have a choice. Like, I just need to kind of grin and bear it. And I want to push back on that and say that you can always take a pause. So even if you're in the middle of a performance review conversation, you could say, hey, is it okay if we take a quick bio break? Like, most people are not going to say, no, you can't do that. They're going to say, yeah, that's fine. I think if there's trust within the group or with that person, you can say, oh, you know what? I'm noticing I'm having a really strong reaction to this. I'm having trouble hearing you. Can we pause and come back to this? I just need to kind of regroup a little bit. So there's always that option too. But I want to at least kind of give you that sense that there is something that you can do there, right? You don't have to kind of just like power through.
So we have a few questions of similar nature, and I actually have this one in my head as well. Kind of turning the tables a little bit. How do you get someone who may be a selective listener, or maybe just isn't great at listening in general, to listen a little bit better?
I get this question a lot because I think we can all think of those people in our lives. The first thing I'll say is I think my book makes a great gift. So if there is someone in your life who you want to give that to, that's one option. But in all seriousness, I think that it's very hard to change other people, like impossible, really. So the best that we can do is to focus on ourselves. And I think part of that is really modeling the behavior. So modeling the kind of listening that you want to receive in return. And, I think the other person will probably notice, and most people want to reciprocate that feeling. So part of it is that. The other part, though, is, there may be people who you practice empathetic listening with, and they just don't get a clue, right? They're just on their monologue track or whatever it may be. And I think there it's useful to have boundaries. And so in some cases, if this is a sort of like repeated stress in the relationship where you realize, wow, I'm giving so much in these conversations and I'm not really being given anything in return, you're probably talking with someone who I would call as a taker. So they're taking in conversation without reciprocating. And I think it's okay to draw some boundaries and to either distance yourself from the person if you can, or if you can't, because this is a colleague, and you have to get along with them, there are still ways that you can architect a conversation in your favor, right? So you can, for the colleague who just talks way too long and doesn't really give you any airspace, you can schedule a meeting instead of doing it in like a coffee shop where you can hang out until whenever. Go out to lunch at a place where the tables turn over pretty quickly, right? Where like they're going to hustle you along, or book a really, really busy conference room where someone is going to be waiting next, right? So there are little things that you can do, or even just saying up front, I only have 20 minutes to chat. I'm all yours for that, and then I have to jet, right? So kind of stipulating that up front, I think, can help.
So relating to that boundaries portion of it, how can you kind of set the example without absorbing someone else's kind of negative energy?
I think setting the example is just like practicing those empathetic listening skills. And in terms of not absorbing their negative energy, I think one reminder, and I think this is true in so many situations, is just reminding yourself that it's not about you. It actually has nothing to do with you. And it tells you a lot about them. And in fact, I do think it's useful information, right? When you learn that someone has this tendency, You know, one option is you try and really understand that and where it's coming from and what is the need beneath their monologuing, for instance. And then the other option is, especially if you've tried that, you know, drawing some boundaries around how much investigation you're willing to do, or how much space you're willing to give them in the absence of having that space yourself.
Yep, most definitely. Next one is a little bit personal. So do you have any daily personal, spiritual, physical, or mental kind of tuning practices that help you to be a better listener?
I am really bad at daily, so I will admit that up front. Anything that I tell you, it's more like I aspire to do this daily than I actually do this daily. I think the biggest things for me are practices that help me kind of get out of my head to a degree, or that help me process what's in my head. And so that can be just taking a walk outside and tuning in with what I'm experiencing or what I'm thinking about, or it can be journaling or drawing. For me, those are ways to just process so that I'm not processing during a conversation, so that I'm not thinking about, oh, there's that thing that's weighing on me and oh, I haven't figured that out. It's like, okay, just have that time to yourself to work on that and try and leave that behind when you go into conversation.
All right, we're going to wrap up with the last two questions. So this one is actually UX research specific. So this one's from Jenny. I heard from my work in consulting world prior that if a conversation is not at least 45 minutes with a user group and interview, it may be hard to get meaningful insights. Have you heard of this before? And my second question is, what's a good length of a meaningful conversation?
So yes, this is pretty common. I would say the length of the conversation completely depends on what you're trying to learn. So if you're doing a usability test, 45 minutes will probably do it. If you're trying to understand how someone, what their shopping routines are like, what their cooking routines are like, 45 minutes is a very short amount of time. You might need 3 hours for that kind of conversation. So I would say the length of time completely depends on what you are interested in studying.
Totally. All right, last one. So this one is personal relationship related. I'm a partner of a deeply feeling ENFP, and I find sometimes the conversation grows and there isn't a clear end to the first part before we move on to the next, and it can feel a little overwhelming. Is there advice for helping keep the conversation on topic without feeling dismissive or restrictive?
I think this is a great one to also think about hitting pause if you need to. I think one of the best things you can do in this kind of scenario is to acknowledge where you started and where you've gotten, and then kind of collectively decide where you want to go. And so that can just be like, hey, it seems like we've talked about X and come to Y conclusion, or we've given this a lot of space. How do you feel about it? Like, I feel like it's pretty complete. Are we on the same page about that? And then kind of regroup. I think the key there is just acknowledge what has happened before you move on to something else.
Definitely. All right. I think that wraps up all of our questions. Those amazing questions. Holy moly, this is a much different level of questions that I'm used to for hosting these webinars. But thank you so much, Samantha, for your time. Presentation was amazing. This is recorded. Everyone should have a link to this. It'll also be uploaded to YouTube. And I'm actually going to toss some links in the chat right now so everyone can connect with Ximena either on Instagram, Twitter, and you can sign up for a newsletter and you can grab a copy of her book. So I'm gonna toss all those links in there right now.
Thank you.
Told me I had too many characters. Hold on, everyone. Oh my gosh. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. So those are all the links. Links to our YouTube channel, the book, Ximena's social accounts, all that fun stuff. And then also while you're on Instagram and Twitter, follow us on those platforms as well, because why not? We should all support each other. Amazing. Thank you again, Ximena. Hopefully we'll talk soon and maybe we'll make the Instagram live happen.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.